Okay, thank you very much. Okay, look, so welcome everybody. We'll come back to the chat later on. Keep the other things coming there during the chat. We'll do it. I'm gonna stop the screen share now because I wanted to come in to see the book. It's very exciting. Literally today, I'll stop the share for now, but literally today, the book arrived at John Catt headquarters, and I know the feeling. And Ollie, you're probably one of the last people to get it because it's got to come all the way physically to you. Tell us where you are right now. Where are you sitting right now?
I'm in Melbourne. I'm in my bedroom. I'm in Melbourne on the lands of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation in Australia.
Wow, that's fantastic. Well, honestly, it's really exciting, and I'm so thrilled this has finally happened. So it's quite a journey, isn't it, to go from the idea for a book through to completion, and here you are. You've kind of done that, and I'm thrilled that we're at that point. For me, it was, the idea of the Inaction series came about when we saw how the Rose and Shine sort of book was received. And then we were thinking cognitive load theory. And immediately I just said, well, the obvious person to write that book is Ollie Lovell. So it was an absolutely, instant thing to say. And the reason for that is because you're so interested in it. And I just thought you're going to know so much about it and you're so interested in it. So before we do that, I just want to just say, ask you how things are for you. And because in England, everyone is going completely mad about COVID. There's a whole new wave of stuff going on. It's like COVID too. How's things in Melbourne at the moment?
Yeah, we're good. We've just come out of another, I think it was 6 weeks of lockdown, which was our second lockdown. And our Premier, Daniel Andrews, has gone really hard on the lockdown. We're maybe in the single digits in terms of new cases every day, but we're still in lockdown, masks everywhere and things like that. So it's been more of a New Zealand style approach, I guess. But yeah, I'm doing okay. It's been very good for writing books to be in lockdown, but obviously not being at school and not seeing the students and things like that has been harder.
Now, one of the things that people know you for is the podcast. I mean, the website you do. In fact, the first time I ever came across you is you do this amazing sort of regular sort of summary of things that you found on the internet and Twitter. And that's where I first saw you talking about cognitive load theory. So that's one of the things you do, but you also do this podcast, ERRR, and I've had the pleasure of being interviewed on it. Just tell people a bit about it. What does it stand for, and what is it like? What do you do with it?
Sure. ERRR is the Education Research Reading Room. And I guess it started because at the time I loved podcasts and I loved education. And I really wanted a podcast that would go really, really deep into different topics rather than skip across the surface. At that time, I hadn't actually found Mr. Barton's podcast, which I think also goes really, really deep with his sometimes 3 or 4 hour interviews. But that's what I was keen to do. And for me, it's really grown, and we're about to release our episode that kind of marks the 4-year mark now, which is amazing. It's crazy how time passes. But the really great thing for me is that each month I get to read a book and then actually talk to the author. So that's an incredible privilege that I wouldn't have without the podcast. And it's great to be able to share that with people too.
No, it is amazing. And it's really grown. So one of the things that, I have a blog, which people know, but I have to confess that I do look at the stats sometimes, and I follow that. I don't know, I'm nerdy about the numbers. Now I looked at the stats for your, on the SoundCloud where ERRR, you get 6,000 listens to it. It just blows my mind. 6,000. If you're into this stuff, and that is huge. So who are all the people listening to you? It's amazing.
Yeah. It's about 50% Australian listeners, and then I think it's about 15% from the UK, 15% from the US, and then the remainder split across the world. So yeah, I've been really happy with the exposure, and some of the episodes are up to, I think the Bill Rogers one is up to 12 or 13,000 now as well. So it's lovely.
Well, that is exceptional, which does mean that you have the sort of reach, and I guess a bit of a profile as someone who knows things, but you ask really good questions. I enjoyed the chat with you. What I loved about it, it was a long chat, so you really go in. It's like no time limit. You just really get in.
Yeah,
that's one thing. And but the one thing I love, I'm going to just say before we move on to talk about the book, is at the beginning, there's a sort of beautiful thing you do at the start. And I said, where you have this sort of appreciation that you do. So tell us a bit about what that is.
Yeah, so I guess it's customary in Australia in general, or it's a good thing to do what we call an acknowledgement of country if you're a non-Indigenous person. That's just say that, you know, where we are today, it's lands, it's stolen lands. And right now, as I mentioned, I'm the lands of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And so that's just a way to pay respects to kind of past and present elders, Indigenous ones. But I guess also for me, there's a bit of a personal connection there because on one side of my family, I'm seventh generation Australian on that side. And so I can actually trace back and see whose lands were stolen to create kind of my family history in Australia. So I feel it is important to do that acknowledgement.
Well, I think that's great. No, and I love that. And there's something about that which kind of right from the beginning, it sort of sets the tone of the kind of, I don't know, there's a kind of groundedness there, which I think is great. It reminds you about what matters. Okay, so look, let's get stuck in. Cognitive load theory, it's something which gets mentioned a lot, and on Twitter people discuss it often without really knowing what it is. And it's something, you know, and you hear and Dylan Williams saying it's the most important thing that anyone should know about, you know, on a talk, and he's on video saying that. So I'm going to just say, like, there might be people who watch this or who listen to it who don't really know what it is at all, really. They just heard about it. So what's the elevator pitch? You've had to say, like, this is what cognitive load theory is, kind of in a nutshell. What is the answer to that?
All right, that's a big question. So I would say that cognitive load theory is a series or a collection of instructional recommendations that are built upon the makeup of the human brain, human cognitive architecture, and have a history of robust randomized controlled trials. So that's the very, very elevator pitch, I guess. And in the rest of the discussion today, we'll dig into that a little bit more.
So it's definitely a collection of things. I think that's quite a clever way of putting it. So it's almost like it's too broad, really, to kind of like not nudge down to a thing. It's a kind of collection of ideas, and I think that's interesting. That makes it sort of complicated, but it's not a simple idea, is it? No. And so, of course, it's associated with John Sweller. Now, one of the great things about you writing this book is that John Sweller is somebody that you've spoken to. You've spoken to him in person, and he's also been involved in the writing of the book. So again, tell us a bit about John Sweller. Who is he? You know, what's his background?
So in terms of John's background, he was born, I think it was in 1946, to parents who were the sole survivors in their family of the Holocaust. So, and then he moved from Poland, and readers will actually see some references to Poland in the book, and that's kind of like a tribute to John in some ways, a little sneaky one there. He came to Adelaide in Australia, and then he classified himself as a mediocre student, but he actually found in university that he had a real knack for designing psychological experiments. And so whilst he classified himself as a mediocre student at school, and then he if you read his paper, Story of a Research Program, he actually writes quite comically and he kind of downplays his own talent. But then he says that he kind of found his niche at university, which was to design experiments, and he went from there. He's what I would call a philosopher. So I actually used to live with a guy who was doing an honours in philosophy, and he was always saying, "Oh, I wish I could be a philosopher." And I said, "What do you mean by a philosopher?" And he would say, "A philosopher is someone who has a vision of the world or an understanding of the world that they themselves have crafted, and they live by that vision." And so I see John as very much a philosopher in that sense. He has this idea of cognitive load theory, which he's played a massive part in shaping, and he actually lives very much in line with that. So I could tell you about how that played out in the writing process, if you'd be interested in that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, tell us. Like, you're interested in some examples of that.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, there's no redundant information with John, right? So I would write a chapter, and then I would send it to him shortly after I'd reviewed it myself. And often I would get a reply back that would just say good or fine. So, you know, I don't know how many chapters there are, probably 12 or 13, probably 4 or 5 of them just had like a one-word answer. So there's no redundancy. Then sometimes I'd send him diagrams, and he'd analyze them in terms of cognitive load theory. He'd say, "Oh, you've split their attention here. There's too many elements here." And then also, even with things like footnotes, Tom would say, "Oh, a footnote splits people's attention." So you should actually integrate it into the text. And if it's not worth integrating into the text, then it's redundant information and you should eliminate it. So it's just like, he just lives and breathes this stuff. And it was really, really great to see it come to life in our conversations and correspondence.
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, I forgot to say this at the start because I feel like we've already got stuck in, but one of the reasons we're doing these sort of webinar things is because normally when you write a book, you make a fuss of it and you invite like 30 people to have a drink and you just raise a glass, because it is a big deal to sort of put that effort in. I know how many hours you spent on this. So I know it's evening for you. For you, it's like 20 to 7 and you're barely awake. But I'm going to say, congratulations. It's an evening for me. And I'm just going to say huge congratulations to you for doing this. And I'm actually going to have a drink of it in a second. But
well, I have a beer here. This is one of my favorite beers, the German Horthaus, but I don't.
Virtual beers. But it's, and hopefully we're watching, like, I think it's an exciting process. So tell us a bit about the process you went through to write the book. So you've got this whole set of ideas. John SWELLER'S kind of on hand to help you. What was it like to work with him beyond those sort of like quirky bits, but in terms of the process of sort of setting out the chapters and stuff?
In terms of setting out the chapters, John didn't really play a key role. So John was incredibly generous. He said, I'm willing to read everything you write and provide feedback, and we can go from there. So I sent him a draft of the layout of the book, the 3 parts, which I know you might ask me about. And he just said, looks good, basically. And I said, okay. So I jumped in after that.
So he let that structure. But one of the things I quite like about this is that because one of the things I found, and why I'm so excited this book is now out there for people, is you hear about cognitive load theory, you Google it, and the only thing that comes up is like this fat book which costs like the sort of library cost of a hardback. And you think, well, I can't really afford to pay for that. I'm not gonna buy that. It's like, but what you've done is you've actually referred to some of his examples, haven't you? Like you've actually said this is actually one of the things that Sweller would. So you haven't just created your own examples. So what did you do that on purpose, or was that just because they're good examples?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, one of the great things about cognitive load theory is it's actually based in this super robust set of randomized controlled trials, and because John is so focused on high quality research, and because he has such a skill in designing those kind of experiments, what that means is the history is just littered with fantastic examples of experiments from different subjects already. So in many ways, cognitive load theory is already in action, although the way that people write about it is quite often in academies, I would say. So yeah, it made a lot of sense to pull as many actual examples from the research as I could find, and that I could see that crossover between that research and the classroom application. And then for areas where there were gaps missing, I kind of tried to fill them in with discussions with teachers, my own ideas and things like that.
Okay, that's good. So what I think people are going to get, because obviously at this point no one's seen the book, but you're going to get a feel of John SWELLER'S work through Ollie's work, which I love. But it's very much your book, but it's got like this sort of taster of the origins, which I think is a great way to do it. It feels like you're kind of paying respects to him at the same time as saying, well, this is what I feel, and it does have this inaction aspect to it. You went through a 3-part structure, so which they almost like sort of get bigger and bigger, don't they? The last part is like much more than a third. But what was your what's your thinking? What are the 3 parts, and what was your thinking there?
So the first part is the ABCDE of CLT. So cognitive load theory often is, like you said, it's got lots of parts, and often, even the name itself, cognitive load theory, it sounds quite hard, quite tricky or complicated. I actually, a few months ago, my mum was like, "Oh, what's the name of the book that you're working on, Ollie?" And I was like, "Cognitive Load Theory in Action." And she said, "Oh, that's not very catchy, is it?" So that's an example of how tricky it sounds. So I wanted to make cognitive load theory really simple. So I just turned it into that ABCDE, and that's the principles. And the reason why we start with principles is because as teachers, no 2 classes are alike, no 2 schools are alike, no 2 days are alike even. So what we want to develop is an understanding of principles, which allows us to have adaptive expertise and adapt what we do to the local circumstances. So when we start with principles, and Graham Nuttall was a big proponent of this, then we develop that adaptive expertise. So I really want to forefront those principles. And then those principles are instantiated in the 2nd and 3rd parts of the book, where the 2nd part looks at ways to optimize intrinsic load, and the 3rd part looks at ways to minimize extraneous load. And so that really captures what I've called the fundamental recommendation of cognitive load theory, which is to reduce extraneous load and optimize intrinsic load. So I've tried to make the book actually reflect that fundamental recommendation.
I think that's great. Yeah. So you kind of get like tooled up. You're thinking, how you start reading it. Okay, I've got the principles, and it's sort of, it does have this sort of textbooky feel about it, which I love. I personally, it's just like perfect. So you're kind of like saying, so key point. And as you're going, you think, okay, I'm getting this, I'm being educated. And then you sort of say, right, so we've got the key ideas now, bam, let's use them. And that to me feels that's really, really, really good.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. So what I've actually said in the book in terms of like, there's a section at the start that says how to read this book. I suggested that people start with the principles and then keep those principles in mind. And hopefully my writing style helps people to do this whilst they read the examples in part 2 and part 3. So part 2 and part 3 is just example after example after example, basically. And then I've suggested they actually, after they've read the examples and got a sense for how it can work in their classroom, revisit the principles to really cement that understanding. Now that you've got the understanding of the principles, the understanding of the examples, you can tie the principles in more strongly to those examples and create stronger memories there. So that's my recommendation there.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, and I think, to be honest, I think that's exactly what you're going to do. As you're going through it, that's almost exactly what you do. You start going, okay, and you find yourself naturally flicking to the start again to remind yourself of the underlying principle, because it's amazing how different it makes when you know why you're doing something in a classroom. To me, it's hugely empowering when you think, I get it. That's why this thing happens.
Yeah, totally.
It's not sort of, it's complicated, but it's not totally mysterious. So look, I think this is going to be your big contribution to this whole field. I really do. Is you have sort of decoded, codified CLT into a structure which is accessible. The ABCDE of CLT. There's going to be a song or something. And this is your thing. So I was checking this with you. You've kind of come up with this sort of this 5 stages, and it is like they start with the letters. So let's hear it. What is the ABCDE? Tell us what those things are.
So these are the kind of principles that underlie cognitive load theory. So A is probably the most important. That's the architecture of human memory. So this is the idea of, the environment, working memory, and long-term memory. And the key idea that comes out of that is that working memory is the bottleneck of thinking, and that bottleneck is limited. And so these are the cognitive resources that we have to deal with, and that's a thread that goes right throughout the other principles and the rest of the book. B is the David Geary's distinction between biologically primary and biologically secondary knowledge. And so this is an idea that within cognitive load theory, and many researchers in that space suggest that we can teach biologically secondary information and we can't teach biologically primary. C is categories of cognitive load. So this is the intrinsic and extraneous, intrinsic being the stuff that we really want our students to learn and focus on, and extraneous being the things that we want to minimize. And this C is linked with the fundamental recommendation of cognitive load theory, which was, as I said before, to minimize extraneous load and optimize intrinsic load. Now that sounds a bit complicated. And so the easiest way to think about that is we minimize the distractions that students are focusing on so that we can free up working memory capacity for them to learn more of the good stuff or the juicy stuff. So that's the fundamental recommendation there. ABCD, yeah? Did you want to say
go for it? No, go for it. Keep going, yeah.
Okay. D is the domain specific versus domain general expertise. And this again relates back to that human cognitive architecture. So the assertion here is that experts differ from novices in large part and potentially primarily for the fact that they have more domain-specific knowledge than the novices. And this relates to the idea that you can overcome the limits of working memory by chunking and automating information. And then E is the final idea, and this is one of the most important ones. This is the idea of element interactivity. So the fact that we know that working memory is limited means that what we need to think about when we instruct students is a number of elements of new information that we're asking them to contend to at a given time. And the number of elements of information and the interactions between those elements, that element interactivity, is a source of all intrinsic and extraneous load. So if teachers can can cultivate a sensitivity and a sense of this element interactivity in their instruction, it puts them in a fantastic place to actually flexibly manipulate their instruction in a way that's going to improve learning. So that's the ABCDE of CLT. It sounds like quite a lot when you kind of talk about it in a minute and a half. But, I've dedicated about 500 words to each. I set myself that goal. I'll try to, explain these key ideas in about 500 words. And then I've also included a little kind of like bullet point summary at the end of that section. So hopefully bring it all together for people.
I just think it's fantastic. So this is exactly the kind of thing which makes learning and understanding something easier. So you have this thing, and even as a sort of aid memoir, you're thinking, okay, so let me just get this back. You can kind of think, okay, so there's the architecture, I get that. There's the thing about what's biologically primary and secondary, so the kind of the stuff that's easy to learn. There's the stuff to do with the loads, and
categories, the categories.
I almost have this sort of like, and I think that's so interesting. Like you're trying to maximize this bit, so you've got to minimize that. And how do we do that? And then you have this thing about domain specific and chunking. All of that to me is like brilliant. And then we have the so to me, it's like, yeah, I get it. And by the time you finish the book, you're going, when all the examples are flowing and you're thinking, yeah, this all just makes total sense to me now. From the perspective of someone who's in a room with kids trying to learn something. So it's
great. And
theoretical, isn't it?
Yeah. Sorry, I wanted to add to what you said there. It's this amazing thing where once you actually get a sense for these principles, you just start to see them everywhere. And particularly with the working memory thing, particularly, or in fact, with all the ABCD of CLT, but particularly also the element interactivity. Like I just see that everywhere now. I see everything. I'll be talking to my partner, we'll be cooking in the kitchen, and I'll be like, oh, too many interacting elements or something like that. It just permeates your life once you really get the hang of it.
Well, I see it all the time as well. So, to me, it's almost like, I mean, to be honest, there's a kind of post hoc rationalization aspect. Like I retrospectively can analyze that situation using the ABCDE, and now I understand why it's a problem. And the inaction part of the book is kind of like, okay, so now I can look up what sort of things could I do in order to teach, therefore, more effectively. But to be honest with you, that sort of half the battle is just even understanding. So. And what I find so fascinating in lessons is just how different kids are interacting. And sometimes the thing of extraneous load, that how easy it is for them to just be not with you, not with the teacher, because they're thinking about the wrong stuff. They're not thinking about the stuff in hand, and creating that focus, maximizing the thinking you want them to be doing, to me is a theme. And now I get I have a language to describe that, or an intuition. Even if I don't go around saying extraneous load and intrinsic load, I don't need to. I can subconsciously kind of evaluate in those terms. It's really, really good stuff. So then we get into the kind of the application side of it, because I think this is where inaction is useful. There's no point having another theoretical thing. In a way there is, but it's only if it makes a difference to us. So we need it to make sense in terms of things teachers do. And I do genuinely believe this, although I think it's important for teachers to understand these things. They don't need to understand them if they're doing the things which make a difference. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not a prerequisite.
Yeah, I agree. I guess I would interject there and quote again one of your favorite authors, Graham Nuttall. He's got a great example in his book, The Hidden Lives of Learners. He says, if you can drive a car, you can drive a car without understanding how it works, right? And you can do well, you can get from A to B, you can be totally successful. The only time you have an issue is when the car breaks down. When a car breaks down and you don't know how it works, then you've actually got problems. So I agree to you to some extent, but then we run up to the limits of that procedural approach eventually, and I'm sure you agree.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and we'll come to talk about some of the limits of it towards the end, because that's always an issue. So let's talk about some of the applications then. So you're a big one for saying, like, what's the main thing or what's your favorite thing? But so I'm going to ask you the same sort of question. What's one of your top applications? Like, if I'm a teacher thinking, look, I get all this stuff is really interesting, but I'm not going to be all nerdy about it. I just want to know what's the main thing I should be doing. Do you have like the main thing, like, this is what I think therefore teachers should do from all of this?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like asking me to choose my favorite child, Tom. But look, there are three that I find, you can apply these principles to almost any class and improve it straight away. And so these are the idea of redundancy, transience, and split attention. So redundancy just basically means cut out anything that's unnecessary. And this book in many ways was a great challenge for me in doing that, because the inactions books are all so short and concise. I was like, how can I cut out any words that I do not need and just drive straight to the point? So that's something, and there's some examples of how to do that in the book, such as the idea of the bulletproof definition, which I actually use in the book as well to communicate ideas clearly. Transience is the idea of when we provide students with information and then take it away and then ask them to apply that information in a new context straight away, we're asking them to hold the information in working memory. And so pulling that away and asking them to hold that info in working memory is transient information, and that generates burden on working memory. So that's another key idea. Often teachers, and this is so prevalent because of the use of slideshows. We'll present an idea on one slide, then we'll go to the next slide and expect people to remember what we've just shown them. So the idea of transience and keeping the information there and accumulating it for students on the one slide or in the one presentation is another quick and easy win. And then the idea of split attention, encouraging teachers to kind of move ideas that, the way I summarize in the book, information that must be combined should be placed together in space and time. So I've kind of tried to make it rhyme and make it easy for people to remember. So moving elements close together that must be integrated so that people don't have to do that integration in their working memory. So they're kind of, I gave you three and you asked for one, but they're three really actionable approaches that, you can improve almost any lesson just like that.
You think, what I find a lot about this sort of thing is a lot of people will just say, when you first hear that, you just think obvious, but it just so isn't. So when you're a lesson observer like me, you sit at the back of a lesson next to a kid who's a bit disgruntled sometimes and trying to engage, and you see the way that the teacher's working their socks off at the front, and the child here has just totally lost the thread because the stuff has gone and they missed it, and they're going what, and that happens all day long for them, and that's, you feel their pain, like it's that, and now you have it explained, the transience thing. It's so common that teachers aren't thinking. You just cannot hold all this new information in your working memory when it's that new, because you're not retrieving it. And sure enough, the kids are super fragile in what they've learned because it was all just barely there, and the teacher's not aware of it, because for the teacher it's got this so familiar to them, they just think they're running through some slides in a fairly low-key way. It's just amazing how different those perspectives can be, and you've explained it exactly there. So yeah, those are good picks. One of my favorite ones is worked examples, and I like this. I mean, it links to the Rosenshine principles, where he talks about worked out examples. So for me, okay, I'm thinking I like it when things connect. But what I like about this is you explore this idea that people often think they know what worked examples are, and they're not what people think they are. So like, what is this? Why are people wrong often, not always, but why are people often wrong when they think they're doing worked examples?
Yeah. So the challenge with worked examples is that we call so many different things worked examples, and every teacher works examples in some sense, but in terms of cognitive load theory, that actually isn't what's meant. And probably the best way to describe this is through an example. So imagine that, and this is what I thought cognitive load theory meant by worked examples originally, and this is what I've done in my classes a lot. So you want to teach a concept, let's say it's a maths class, I'm a maths teacher, I model maybe 2 questions for the students, I check for understanding, I say, are there any questions? Do you understand? Do you have any questions? I'm like, okay, they've seen my worked example, and then I give them maybe 4, 6, 8 practice problems similar. So a lot of people see that, I've just done some worked examples and I've given you practice problems. That's actually the problem solving condition in cognitive load theory. So what we often see as work examples is actually what cognitive load theory calls problem solving, because all you've done, they call the first stage modeling, and then the second stage with the student independent practice as problem solving. And so what cognitive load theory says is take that modeling, take that problem solving, split them apart, and in the middle, in the transition between the two, that's where we place our worked examples. And in cognitive load theory, the most common approach there is the alternation strategy. So in that middle part, after we split apart the modeling, I'm just analysing what I'm doing right now in terms of
you keep going.
Like I'm trying to use the hand. So between the modelling and the independent practice is that alternating worked examples, and what that looks like is a written worked example, and then a similar problem for students to solve, then another written example, and then another similar problem for students to solve, and things like that. And so the key difference between this and what we usually do is the level of persistence of the instruction and of the scaffolding and of the support of the students. And Sweller and Ward in particular in one of their papers argue that, we often assume that after the modeling, students have actually got it, but really that's just the start. That's just the orienting them to the problems. They still need a lot more scaffolding and persistence in that scaffolding before they get to the truly independent problem solving or question answering. So that's the key idea there, and the difference is that persistence with the worked examples.
And does that link to the concept of backward fading? Is that from Sweller as well?
Yeah, so in that middle space between the modelling and the independent problem solving, this is where we can sit worked examples. And so one approach to that is alternation, which I just described there. And the another approach that could be swapped in for alternating is the faded worked example approach, which is where you provide first a full worked example, and then second, you get students to complete part of the worked example themselves, maybe the last line or the first line, and you gradually get them to complete more and more of it until they arrive at that independent practice at the bottom.
Yeah, you know what, and I really think this, for me, when I'm reviewing this, in terms of I'm thinking like, what am I going to take from this book and this whole idea to support me to work with teachers? I think it's this, because to me, this is where I see the biggest weakness. And it's not a sort of like so I worked with a teacher earlier this year who was an English teacher trying to do modeling. And she was sort of saying, like, I feel like I'm doing the modeling, but when the students, they don't, it almost like she felt like I do the modeling, I feel like I'm really clear, clear, they're with me, and then they just can't still do it. And it's this thing of that bridging. And to me, this is the goal. This is it. It's that kind of hand holding. It's the doing it together, step by step, at the rate they need it to be, step by step, to be with you, and sort of then weeding them off. And it's basically too many teachers just sort of like dump and run. It's like, here you go, right? And they feel they can't. And of course, some kids can cope in that situation, but the weaker students really can't. And this is the thing. And it has a name. It has a rationale. And you explain that superbly well. I mean, this is just a question more broadly. When you're a maths teacher, what I love, actually, honestly, in your book is that when you do maths examples, they're really hard ones. You're not afraid to throw in some like calculus tables and stuff. I'm thinking, great. Books should have calculus in them, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. But how have you found it, like referencing other subjects? Because you have. I mean, there's tons of subject examples in the book. It's brilliant for that. How hard did you find doing that?
It was a mix. So a lot of the subject examples came from the research itself. As we talked about before, we drew from there. I guess I'm lucky in that I've played quite a bit of music in my life and learnt music. I studied economics as well. Obviously, I've done some science and maths, so I had a few of those things covered off. And then, but also just doing the ERRR, I've spoken to a lot of people. So I've spoken to Judy Hochman of the Writing Revolution. I contacted her and we talked about a few of the examples together. But then also I just talked to some other people, like my mate Ben, who's the art teacher at school. And I came up with a bunch of ideas about how these principles could be applied. And then I just went to him and I said, hey, Ben, here's some ideas for how to apply cognitive load theory in an art class. Do these make any sense, or do these sound actually ridiculous to an art teacher? So generating ideas and then testing them with real teachers in the world. So yeah, combination of different approaches.
Yeah, but I think you've done a good job. It does feel like you've kind of gone out of your way to sort of say, look, the applications are kind of for teachers to kind of discover in a way, but you're sort of signposting the fact that there's relevance and applications there. Okay, so here's another one. Here's one of my favorite ones, the goal-free effect. And I have to say, I first read about this in Craig Barton's book about maths teaching. But I think he was referencing Sweller anyway at that point. And he might even have been referencing you referencing Sweller, I don't know, but it's sort of what the goal-free effect seems to be slightly against the idea of instructional teaching until you know what it is. So tell us, but you focus towards the end of the book. I mean, you spent quite a bit of time on it. So what is it, and why do you think it's so useful?
Yeah, there's a few ideas encapsulated in the goal-free effect, and one of the ways I like to describe the goal-free effect is with a metaphor. So imagine you're trying to get to the top of a mountain. That's your goal, your learning goal, right? One approach to getting to that goal, and I didn't actually use this metaphor in the book, but I think it's a powerful one. One approach to get to that goal is to, every few minutes, you basically look and you go, all right, how far away is the top of the mountain now? Right, it's there. I probably need to walk this way, walk a little bit. How far away is the top of the mountain now? It's over there. I need to go this way a little bit, right? And so what this is called in the literature is a means end analysis. It's constantly checking how far you are away from your goal and adjusting your trajectory, to deal with that. So that's a mean ends analysis, and that's a goal-specific approach where you're always focusing. The issue with that approach is what you can do is you can find that you do get to the top of the mountain, but because your attention the whole time was focused on where the top of the mountain was, you actually haven't learned the terrain around you. You haven't learned anything about it. And if someone were to take you to the bottom of the mountain again, and it was misty and you couldn't see the top of the mountain anymore, you wouldn't actually remember the paths that you've traveled on because your attention was at the top of the mountain the whole time. So that's the goal-specific approach. A goal-free approach is saying, there is a top of a mountain somewhere. We're not going to worry about where it is. Maybe there's clouds over the top of the mountain. Just explore the mountain, right? And get to know the terrain. And the benefit here is that if you come back a week later, you still know the terrain. You actually have a much deeper understanding of how it's all put together, and you've noticed a little pile of moss or the nice tree here and things like that. And you've kind of made it your own. So that's one of the big ideas of the goal-free effect, which is that having a specific goal can take attention away from the actual learning. And before you mentioned Dylan Wiliam and the way in which he says that cognitive load theory is the most important thing for teachers to know, this is why Dylan says that, because the goal-free effect has shown that when there's actually a goal there, that can take students' attention away from the actual learning and mean they can get to the goal, they can perform without actually learning anything at all. So that's one of the big ideas. But the thing is, that's quite vague, right? Explore the mountain. So for a goal-free approach to actually work and not just be kind of aimless exploration, there's a few conditions we need. So one is we need restricted actions. The second is we need rapid feedback. And the third is we need reliable results. So they're the 3 R's that I kind of pulled out of the research. So restricted actions means, again, back to the mountain metaphor, if there's too many paths to explore, it stops being a mountain, it starts to be a maze, and you just get lost and you can't actually learn it because there's too much for your working memory to deal with. So that's restricted actions. And so in a problem solving scenario, we wouldn't want too many things that students can do. Rapid feedback means that when students take an action, they need to quickly see the result. Because when you're exploring a new field, you need to be able to see the connection between your actions and the result in order to make the connections and learn about the causality within that domain. So you need rapid feedback and reliable results related to rapid feedback. Reliable results means if students do something, they need to actually see the actual answer from that. And so these 3 ideas are a big reason why a lot of the goal-free exploration, we could say, is carried out in computerized environments. And that's been the case with a lot of the goal-free research. This is because you can actually restrict the actions that students can take. You can give them quick feedback, like you can do an environmental simulation. One of the things I talk about in the book is an environmental simulation of changing the numbers or the populations of 4 species of marine animal and changing the salinity and the water and the temperature and seeing that. Now, you couldn't do that as a real experiment because the populations would change too slowly. But on a computer simulation, you can get a student to change a variable and get rapid feedback and see that straight away. And then also reliable results. A computerized environment, if a student takes an action, they could even drag a piece in that says like, take the derivative of this function or something like that. And it could just give that straight away. So the big idea and I've gone a bit deep here, and this is one of the dangers of writing a book. You end up with this massive schema that you just want to communicate to people, but it ends up overloading them. But the big idea is overt focus on a goal can take attention away from the learning. So that's a big idea. And then in terms of implementing it, we need to make sure that we give students restricted actions, rapid feedback, and reliable results.
No, it's great. That was like, a round of applause. I asked this question, it's like, and you kind of nailed it there. And for people who haven't read the book, I mean, I'm getting this thing of like overlearning here because I've read it, and now you're making sense to me again because I've read the book. So people who haven't, this is, you'll have to play this video back another time or something, but it really does warrant that, because initially when you hear things on the surface, you think goal-free effect sounds like discovery learning, but because of those which again is probably characterized in ways which aren't fair to it either, but these constraints are really, really important, aren't they? And some examples like find all the angles in these triangle, in these shapes, find all the angles in these parallel lines and shapes. Brilliant. And that's goal free. You have to find them all, but you don't have to find, and then you can say, so what's the angle there? Angle A is this. Great. Whereas if you just have to find angle A, that's all you do. And those sorts of things are super practical in action type things, aren't they? I mean, they really
Definitely
are.
And I'll add to that. So that's the thing with the goal free. A lot of people know about these like find all the angles kind of approaches. The thing is that if you just do that in your classroom, it might not be that successful, because in those studies, when it really drilled down, what you find out is that the students often had an experimenter sitting next to them, ensuring this rapid feedback and these reliable results. So what happens is a student would try, some trigonometric identity or something to work out an angle. And if they were doing something that wasn't allowed, or they made a calculation error, the experimenter would say, you made a mistake there. Right? So they're actually getting this rapid feedback, and it's only with that kind of rapid feedback and reliable results that this goal-free approach can work. So if we don't have that rapid feedback and we just say calculate all the stuff, a student could spend half an hour calculating all the stuff incorrectly and just reinforce misconceptions that they have, or just get tied in a total knot. So these constraints, as you called them just then, or boundary conditions as other people call them, are incredibly important, and they're the things that we must be aware of when we're trying to design our own instructional approaches, supposedly in line with these strategies.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to think of lots of different ways of trying to explain to people, like, I don't know, can you find all the different colors that make green or something, or if it's green, it's green, and if it's not, it's not. So there has to be a sort of self-checking element to it.
That's a good way to put it.
And it's that type of thing. So that constraint. Okay, so I mean, I just think people will really, really get into this, and I do think goal-free, in some of the examples that you give, I'm just going to sort of big up the book here. Some of the examples in different subjects about goal-free learning opportunity, I think, are great. Okay, one of the things that I just want to move on a bit is just a couple more questions, and we'll just open up to the chat. Is you do explore the split attention phenomenon and do a lot of things about diagrams and stuff. Now, one of the things that and Oliver Caviglioli has this problem sometimes, where he's trying to talk in a fairly deep way about visual images, and then sometimes people pick up on a thing and they just end up spending ages sort of beautifying worksheets. And you think he's never really intended you to do that, and there are constraints and limits, and he doesn't want you to stick icons on everything. It's just not. But people pick that up, and then. So I was thinking, there is a risk that people are going to spend ages sort of remaking all their worksheets to sort of deal with the split attention effect and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's worthwhile? I mean, like, for example, putting the information next to the thing and all of that. I get the reasoning. How big an issue is it, do you think, that some of the resources students have do split the attention?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's three things I want to say on that. Hopefully I can remember all of them. The first one is that the redundancy effect actually kind of tempers this. So if you start by cutting out redundancy, you'll find that there's a lot less stuff you need to integrate if you do need to integrate it. So that's the first step. Cut out any duplication. The second thing is that, and this is a mistake that's often made, the split attention effect, information that must be combined should be placed together in space and time. So we only have to integrate information if it is only understood if it's together. If you've got a full description here that makes sense by itself, and then a diagram that makes sense by itself, don't integrate them, because that's actually worse, right? So that's another thing. So maybe it doesn't occur as frequently as we'd like, as frequently as may be the case. Another thing is, like, you don't have to make it look beautiful to integrate it. Integrating it can actually be you with a marker, the diagram's projected on the board, and you're just drawing lines and writing the words rather than just having the slab of text above it. So there's more flexible ways to do it. And the final thing is that a really exciting area of cognitive load theory at the moment is the look at the exploration of self-management of the cognitive load effects. And the research here in this space is finding that actually teaching students about split attention can help them to integrate the information for themselves. And this is a really valuable skill. So for example, say a student's doing an exam, maybe a physics exam, and there's a diagram and there's an explanation. If you teach students about the split attention effect, they can learn to actually take the information and put it onto the diagram and integrate it as one step. And then they can kind of ignore the stuff at the top and just look at the diagram, and it's integrated, and that reduces the load in their working memory. And this is another thing that you can do if you make sure you have, for example, a PDF reader that allows you to split screen, and you find that there's a graph on one page and the description on the next, then you can independently scroll the top and independently scroll the bottom. So you're actually kind of reducing the interactivity between those elements yourself. And so knowledge is not students having the knowledge, or you as the learner having that knowledge, can mean that the author or the teacher doesn't have to do all the integration, and the student can actually take on some of that responsibility. So there's some big ideas there, but also I would say, as with all things in education, it's about trade-offs. And is the time spent 2 hours trying to integrate this diagram going to be better than maybe really making sure that you revisit that diagram 3 times over the next 2 weeks or something like that, which probably has a bigger impact than focusing on these really fine details.
Yeah, so that's a sort of common sense thing that you have to work it out a little bit, but I do think the principles are really useful. But you need to probably, like, when you evolve towards some of those things and just learn a discipline, that kind of lean, clean diagrams, the redundancy thing being a big factor. Oh boy, do people love to prettify. It's like, geez, I do love the fact there's a sort of a bit of a science behind lessons more. It's not just a phrase. It's really helps people. Okay, so last sort of question really about this is, for some people, I mean, I don't want to get into sort of particular individuals or anything, because I think that's not appropriate, but I've seen sort of people almost like desperate to pull CLT down, like they talking about how one day it'll be like the new brain gym, or sort of laughed out of town, and sort of on a mission to debunk it. Like, and for some reason it offends people because it leads to kind of a conclusion that instructional teaching is required, and that's against their kind of paradigm for how education should be, which is much more student-centered, and so on and so on. And therefore it would be good if CLT sort of was disproved, because then it would validate their worldview. I mean, I do think they'd probably think that was unfair, but that's how it comes across. So okay. I think it's good to sort of get your defenses in early. What do you think are the limits of CLT really? I mean, it's not a universal theory for all life in the classroom, but no. What do you think is kind of like Achilles' heel is, like, where you think, probably that's not as strong as it could be, or perhaps we shouldn't, that's not a big, I wouldn't overplay that too much. What do you think?
Yeah, so I guess the great thing about CLT, and the reason why I don't see that it's going to be a fad, is because, well, one, it's got a humongous amount of humongous number of randomized controlled trials behind it, where it has been demonstrated that these effects have measurable impact on student learning. And a lot of that learning is with novice learners. So that's one thing. And it's built, and the other thing is that it's built on the architecture of our memory. So as long as humans think and learn in the same way, these findings should be robust and they shouldn't change. And I don't see that as something that's going to change anytime in the near future. In terms of weak points or things that are questionable, we've got that ABCDE of CLT. for me, the strongest part of that is the ace in the hand, you could call it, that you need, which is the architecture, the categorization of intrinsic and extraneous load, and the element interactivity. They're the kind of three ideas that I think are most central. This means that the B and the D to me, they're less central. And in particular, the B, the distinction between biologically and primary and biologically secondary knowledge, that's not something that we can test really easily. And also, I went through a lot of the research trying to find really concrete definitions and justifications. And I couldn't find as concrete information as I would have liked to. And I found a few criticisms of it as well. So to me, that's maybe one of the areas that's not quite so fixed. And also with the domain specific, domain general stuff, especially when we talk about 21st century skills and things like that, it's quite interesting looking into the cognitive load research. You start to get to know the authors, and they're quite split on this, and you'll actually find it didn't end up in the final book, but I did do an analysis of what different authors said about this domain general, domain specific thing over time, and some authors have said completely contradictory things within a year of each other, and then like swap back. So they'll say you can teach domain general, you can't teach domain general, you can teach domain general, or vice versa. So I'd say there's still quite a bit of debate in that space, and that debate also stems from what is domain general and what is domain specific. So I had a chat with John about the idea of, well, is cognitive load theory itself domain general? Because, I've just learned these principles and now I've applied them to all these domains, from maths to science to art to PE, right? So there's one. And then the other idea that's kind of casts a bit of doubt or questioning around that is like, what does that actually mean to teach? So John would say that you can't teach domain general stuff or biologically primary stuff, but you can provide an environment in which students can develop those skills more independently. And so it's like, well, are we just talking about semantics here, whether we can teach it or not? Is it just how we're thinking about teaching? So for me, the ACE are the real bedrock and the backbone, and then the D and the E, I look forward to exploring those issues more in the future, I guess I could say.
Yeah, I think it's good. I think it's healthy to acknowledge that we don't have a sort of cast iron, rigid theory, which, like Newton's laws, which even those have limits. But let's not get into that. But you know what I mean? Like we're not pitching that. We're just saying, are these ideas useful as a model to help us explain what we see, and which help us direct towards actions we can take, which help students learn more, and then we have to define what learning more means. And my feeling is, yeah, we can, and therefore it's useful. But it's like there is a black box aspect to it where, we're not entirely certain about it. One of the things I think is interesting is I read a thing recently about offloading offloading working memory, through sort of collaborative learning and so on, and that kind of thing of how do groups function, and I don't know. So there's so many elements to it which do then support some aspects of collaborative learning through a cognitive load. And you think so? Some of these ideas are not oppositional. You just need to understand the limits, the parameters, the circumstances. Well, look, I could talk to you for hours about this. I think it's so brilliant. But we've got people. I mean, just in case we've got any questions in the chat, if people have got any questions, please fire them at us or whatever. And I hope we've given you a flavour of what's to come. Honestly, there's no one better than Ollie to explore these ideas, and you're going to want to get this book. So my massive sales pitch is buy this book, because you're going to want to read it, and you'll be really glad that you did.
Does John Catt have a special on at the moment as well? I think they might.
I think it ends at end of half term, so they do a sort of 50% off during the half term period. So your sort of books being released during a discounted zone. So that'll hopefully get it off to a flying start. But
okay.
I think generally speaking, the inaction series is going to grow. And we've had the Mark and Zoe Entz are doing the generative learning. The next book that's coming up is John Tomsett's book about a cognitive apprenticeship, a paper by Collins et al. And that's really interesting about different subjects, how you think like a scientist, think like a mathematician, think like a historian. And what I love is how all these ideas kind of connect into a bigger piece. But I guess, you know, in a year's time, all these books will be out and people will hopefully be able to get a box set or something, but we haven't got that far. So look, honestly, if people have got questions, just put them in there. But if not, I mean, I think you probably explained it all too well. People are just going to go, give me the book.
If there are any questions, I'll just add one thing to your final question there, which was around the limits or the weak points or something. And I think you kind of hit onto it already. Cognitive load theory isn't a theory of everything. It's focused primarily on like the delivery of information to novice learners, right? And so I know you're a fan of Martin Robinson's book, Trivium 21C, and I'm reading that right now. So I'd say cognitive load theory is more about that grammar, that knowledge side of things and that presentation in the early stages. But then we also have this dialectic, this rhetoric. We have these other different parts of the student that we want to develop. And that's something that cognitive load theory isn't focused on and hasn't focused on, may focus on in future. But it's only part of the puzzle of what it takes to become a competent and well-rounded teacher and have a competent, well-rounded school, I guess. So that's another important thing to mention, I guess.
And there are other things like the expertise reversal effect and all kinds of stuff. I mean, you just get into this and that does affect students who are already quite knowledgeable, that you need to. Okay, so James has got a question here. It says, you know, hearing about children learning to manage their own learning, it sounds like a fascinating avenue. Do you know of any other research currently taking place in this area of students learning to manage their own learning?
Yeah, so the search term there would be self-management of cognitive load, and Alexander Renkel has done a bunch of research in that space, and there's some other stuff. I actually dedicate a section in the last chapter of the book to that and have included quite a few references, but it is really quite a fresh and burgeoning area, and one that I hope to explore more myself in future.
Yeah, it's a good answer. This question, I'm just going to go this one because it's something which I think might take a bit of a longer answer. Big fan and so on, interested to hear about the concept of transients. I'm curious to know your thoughts about where germane load fits in, because you've mentioned intrinsic load and extraneous load, but what about germane load? I mean, but that's quite a long question there, but what, just in case I sort of I fluff reading out, what are your thoughts about where germane load fits in?
So the germane load cognitive load theory researchers' approach to germane load has changed over time. So the initial iteration of cognitive load theory had that intrinsic, germane and extraneous, but in the recent paper, Cognitive Load Theory 20 years on, they've actually recategorized germane load and said it isn't actually this in the same categories in intrinsic and extraneous. It's actually better thought of as the way that cognitive resources are in a germane fashion redistributed from extraneous load to intrinsic load. So it's more like a transfer kind of a function there. I thought about including in the book, but I actually, after going through the research, I thought, look, I don't actually think this adds that much. It's perhaps redundant. And so I took it out. I wrote the chapter without it. And I said to John, look, I haven't included germane load here. I think that's going to make it clearer to teachers, the distinction between intrinsic and extraneous. And I think that germanes get a few things and muddy the waters. What do you think? And John basically said, yes, I think that's nice and clear, and that's totally comprehensive, sufficiently comprehensive. So that's where we went with there.
Yeah, I think that's a good shout. I mean, to me, even I've spent a lot of time trying to work out what it means, and I'm not sure if it's helped me.
Yeah.
This is an question. I think it's a really good question. How do you deal with listen lessons? So if I teach a specific new idea to a group and then have to wait for them to be stored in long-term memory, you have to wait to the next lesson at the earliest to apply it to other problems. And is that, you know what I mean? This time aspect. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think that's, in many ways, that's a really good interpretation. And I think it's a John Mason quote or something like teaching takes place in time, but learning takes place over time. And we do actually have to allow time for students to integrate information into their schemas, into their long-term memory, and then also to forget in some ways before we can get them to build on this. And, you know, there's some people who would say that, you know, you can't use mathematical skills for high-level problem solving unless you learned them something like 2 years ago, right? They really have to be that integrated for you to be able to use them flexibly. But again, ideas like from before, like I mentioned, in terms of transients, like having a summary there that you get students to use in the same lesson that you taught the concept, and then have them apply that idea, and then, you know, move away that scaffolding as the information makes its way into their long-term memory.
Okay, that's interesting. Last couple of questions. I mean, I think, you know, James is saying that it's interesting that you're talking about it. CLT is itself domain general, which is interesting. And a couple of things though, do you teach this explicitly to your students, and do you include metacognition? So there's two sort of related, I'm not sure those are related, but those are the two other questions we've had.
Yeah, well, I guess if you are learning about cognitive load theory will give you greater metacognitive abilities, because you will understand the learning process more. And this is actually something I talk about quite a bit in the last chapter, when I talk about my own journey as a learner in terms of trying to learn languages and things like that. And even at uni, and the power that I felt I was given when I learned about this architecture of human memory idea. So I think it's very related. I have taught my students about it a little bit in the past, not as much as I would like. I'm moving to a new school next year, and I'm hoping that we can do a bit more work around that for sure.
Okay, so that's interesting. And metacognition is you know, it's interesting. So yeah, I mean, I to be honest with you, I feel like in terms of this particular set of ideas, my hunch is that it's hard enough for teachers to use and apply and really, you know, make it, you know, really make the shifts that perhaps they should be. To involve students along that journey you know, you have to be cautious about that possibly, but.
Yeah. In some ways, I think well, actually, no. I definitely agree. And you know, if you try to introduce new information and get students to be metacognitive about that information at the same time, then that can be a big challenge. So splitting them apart is a really valuable thing to do. Something I could add there is that this new research into self-management of cognitive load effects, that is basically just metacognition. It's teaching students about them and then saying, if you can monitor your own thinking, you can monitor whether your attention is split, you can monitor whether there's redundant information. And they've found that by teaching students these strategies and these principles, students can monitor and control their thinking in a way that improves their learning.
Okay, that's fantastic. And in the book you talk, and it's, you know, and James is here, you mentioned some software, some Dendro and some technology. Mm-hmm. In fact, you know, good uses of technology for teachers is something which is always up for discussion. Beyond the kind of the app fad fest, you know, we need really good productive uses which teachers need. Do you think this is an area, and is Dendro one of those solutions?
Great question. So Dendro is a software that's designed to help people maximize their productivity in their self-directed learning. So it's not actually a product. This is a project that I'm working on myself. And it basically helps you to read information, clip it out, revisit it in a spaced fashion so that you take advantage of that spacing effect, and then to turn those things into kind of like flashcards for the long term to help you build your memories. So that's something that's built for independent learners rather than classroom application. But on that, I actually used Dendro to write this book. So one of the challenges with this content is that there was just so much to get through, and relating it all, seeing the connections, pulling out, you know, those 3 R's of the goal-free effect, you know, restricted actions and things like that. There was so much to deal with that I needed some structured way to get through it, and Dendro provided that for me. And I don't think I could have written the book, and I know I 100% wouldn't have come up with the ABCDE of CLT if it wasn't for Dendro, because I actually did a lot of that ideation in the program. Tools can definitely support, as long as they're the right tools and as long as those tools are used for the right purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I mean, when you get used to, when you're trying to write an essay, sometimes it's just overwhelming, isn't it? It's the number of ideas and sequencing them. So having a tool for kind of selecting and organizing. So yeah. I think that's probably the last question here, because I think we've been going for an hour now, and you probably have to get up and go to work or something. How do you feel about this other thing about display boards, and classrooms? I guess the idea of them being distracting or whatever, but I don't say that, but the physical environment in general, what contribution does that play into this whole cognitive load concept?
Yeah, I guess a few things on that. And this seems to be, I think it was Craig Barton who's kind of been leading the charge on this display board thing in the UK, at least anyway. I think in the early stages of learning, it can be helpful to have that external scaffold. in the early stages. But what you actually want to do is you want to help students move that information from the external environment into their long-term memory. So if it's a scaffold for something that students are learning, and if you're taking some deliberate action to move that information into long-term memory, so maybe you have a board and then one day they come in and there's a piece of paper over one of the elements and you say, what's under this piece of paper? And you gradually cover the things up, and that's like a faded worked example in some ways. And then so eventually it's just like a white wall and the student can look at it and recall all the information. Then that's going to be helpful. But then there are other arguments saying that, you know, once you end up with too much stuff on the walls, it actually becomes distracting and extraneous load and things like that. I tried to read some studies on this. I didn't find that the randomization was done in a particularly compelling way. And like, I don't think that it was convincing enough for me to make a definitive argument to either end of the spectrum, but I would just reinforce those principles, which is external scaffolds can be helpful in the early stages, but the ultimate goal is for it to be in long-term memory.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I mean, I've been to some classrooms which feel like they've been sort of sterilized, you know, and they're germ-free. There's not a single, like they're plain walls, everything's plain. And other classrooms where you feel like there ought to be some sort of like health warning about, you know, about flashing lights, because they think, geez, like every word in German is written on the wall on some sort of bubble. And it's like, really, it's just too many, like, so and that feels distracting. I suppose if you're even noticing the distraction, it's probably distracting. But on the other hand, you can probably overplay it too much. But it's something to be thinking about. Well, look, what I'd say to people is that, first of all, I want to say massive thanks to everyone who's dialed in live, which is really great to have that support, and it's encouraging. Anyone watching the recording, I hope you've enjoyed it. But mainly, I want to just say congratulations to Ollie. I think it's brilliant to have a book that people are going to talk about a lot. It's going to be really helpful to a lot of teachers. I know what it feels like to give birth to a piece of work after a lot of time, and that sense of sort of pride you have in it, and hoping that you get a good response. But I really hope that you get the response you deserve. It's just a great piece of work. Thank you so much for writing it and bringing it to the world. So well done. Thank you, everybody. We're going to sign off now, and you can relax now, Ollie. The pressure's off. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom. And I'll also got to say, Tom, thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this series. I'm surprised to hear how you think it was such an obvious choice to choose me. And I'm really honored that I was given the opportunity to contribute. And I need to thank you for the idea of bringing the series and for the tireless work that you do. I know today you've recorded 2 presentations and drafted 5 sections of a new book. You're just an absolute powerhouse, and you're doing amazing things for education. And that also really, your expertise really shone through in the recent EAAA episode, which so many people have written to me about and said, wow, Tom just has this ability to cut to the heart of what's important in education, and you do. And this series is a great example.
The reason I don't have anything else to do. Well, the place is all mine. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for joining us. But we're going to leave it there. Thanks very much. Bye bye.